Sanibonani. Sanibonani. Tober. Sanibonani. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I've sent all of the whips out to bring us all in. I'm grateful for those of us who are here on time. But we have to press on with the program. So thank you very much for being on time. And so we transitioned in our conversation this afternoon to learn from all of the commissions who have had some time to examine some of these difficult and challenging issues. Since he's not in the room, the comment from Confi was, there's nothing earth-shattering here that I hear. So I will also be here using that, Minister, that earpiece of mine in order to understand, like you and like all of us, the extent to which our national basic system is in a good state or in a troubled state, and what the issues are that require our specific and detailed attention in the years ahead. I want to, of course, again just reinforce that the NECT has had a series of roundtables, and therefore this roundtable must not be seen as an isolated, random, out-of-the-blue exercise. So far we have had, as we learned earlier this morning, roundtables, policy roundtables on governance, on resourcing, on curriculum, on teachers, and on rural education. And so I just want us to be mindful that what we seek to do in these conversations and roundtables is to bring the best and brightest minds together in order for us to provide specialist, expert, and practice-oriented advice. The purpose of which is, as the Minister reminds us, that the advice would not be sitting in a book, gathering dust on a bookcase, but the more practical, the more specific the advice is, the Minister feels she can take that forward with her department in a meaningful and a substantive manner. And so I think we are ready to roll. I know that a number of our colleagues are still working on their reports, but I want to kick off and firstly ask if our colleagues in governance are ready to share with us their insights. Not yet. Our colleagues on teachers, the Teachers Commission, are you ready to share with us? Not ready. I know that Brahm, that you're ready on curriculum. Can I invite you to join us and to share with us the insights and perspectives? I've also been asked if you could just look around where you are sitting, whether you don't see a missing microphone near where you are sitting. So if you do find it, if you could just hand it over to our colleagues here on my right-hand side. Thank you very much. Of course.
The most recent one.
Okay.
I'm saying which thing? What? Curriculum. Okay. No, it's on here.
Oh,
It's
you
the
changed
report back. No, it's the
I've got it here.
back. No, it's updated.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and just like to thank everybody who was part of the curriculum group. I think we had a wide-ranging discussion, and I think it was incredibly useful. A whole range of issues came up that we hadn't anticipated, and I think will certainly enhance the discussion in the plenary. I also just like to thank Chetty, where's Chetty? Somewhere in the back, for helping me put this together in the presentation. So again, this is the curriculum thematic group, and in large part we were framed our discussion around the sub-themes that the original team had given to us to focus on, which included a look at the extent to which we should be incorporating 21st century skills, the debate about the curriculum, differentiated curriculum. In fact, it's not the differentiated curriculum so much as the differentiated streams, looking at qualifications, both the NSC and the grade 9, national assessment, particularly the new developments around the annual national assessment and the new versions that it's likely to take, the issues around language, which obviously is central to our concerns, literacy and reading, retention, dropout, ICTs, STEM, and ECD. I'm not going to go over the presentation we made, but I'm rather going to report on some of the big themes that emerged in our discussions. So the first respondent reflected a theme that you'll see emerged over and over again, and that is reading as number one. There's a recognition that the entire system is dependent on the extent to which children can have mastered reading and writing and mathematics in the foundation phase. Recognition not just about home language, but both home language and first additional language. Those are the issues that essentially undergird, they support, they provide the foundation for the entire system. And there's obviously issues around the extent to which we could and should be thinking about the role of ICT in that process. The first speaker, the first respondent from the floor, also talked about that there is, although there's clearly enormous progress that have been made around the CAPS curriculum, he identified the problem with sequencing in science and maths, and particularly sequencing progression and poor quality in the curriculum. And he's suggesting while much of the curriculum is adequate, we might want to think very hard about whether we revisit particularly the intermediate phase around maths and science. There was a discussion around, or at least some comments around, the importance of 21st century skills, those skills that are increasingly relevant to the new world of work. And there's a consensus that not only is it important, but in fact, the CAPS curriculum does incorporate many of those 21st century skills. They may not necessarily be implemented as intended, but they're certainly there as part of the basket of our CAPS curriculum. A great deal of attention, and I've reorganized this a little bit, is focused around comments around the question of language, and particularly home language. There's a concern that language remains a critical issue, but in fact, there's a growing recognition that it's not just a question of whether it's English or home language, but it's also about the quality of teaching of home language that is at the center of the new debates. And that we need to be paying a great deal of attention to the curriculum resources and the curriculum itself around home language. We also obviously recognize that the transition from home language to first additional language is often an uneven process, and we need to have a curriculum responsiveness that reflects that unevenness as children move from home language and transition over an extended period. And in fact, sometimes they continue to use home language even in the main teaching process up and into the secondary school system. So we need to pay attention, given that, to how we think about and how we use code switching. There's a couple of people raised the question about whether, in fact, we shouldn't just be talking about 2 languages, and whether 2 languages were necessary at the grade 12 level. Others took a very different turn on that discussion and suggested for reconciliation, it's more important that we not only talk about 2 languages, but in line with what are the policy discussions at the moment, we need to be thinking about 3 languages. And a theme that came up repeatedly is the question about whether, in fact, the challenge that we currently face for the next period going forward is a problem of policy or whether it was a problem of implementation. And clearly there are some areas where there's clear need for new policy, but there's clearly, in many people's perspectives, in the curriculum group, there is a need to think harder and more robustly about how we develop capacity and assess curriculum or curriculum policy going forward. We had some discussion about assessment, and one of the questions was, to what extent should assessment be a central piece of the curriculum process? And Anil specifically raised a very important point about the fact that we need to be thinking about assessment for learning, and learning is the centerpiece of that. So if we don't really think about learning, and that shifts the focus around assessment from external formative assessment to thinking about improving their capacity for formative assessment within the context of classrooms and classrooms themselves. And we had a very important insight about, one of the themes was retention and dropout. And we have a policy at the moment around promotion, which not deliberately but inadvertently may exacerbate the problem of retention and dropout. So there's a question about whether we rethink the policy given the potential unintended consequences of children being promoted without the necessary support when they're having difficulties early on in the system, and when they get beyond the compulsory phase, that's when the kind of dropout becomes an acute problem. So that was that arose in the course of the discussion. There was also a suggestion that while STEM is very important, we need to be maybe rethinking that title to incorporate art, recognizing that art may play a very important role as a 21st century skill and should be expanded the group from just STEM to STEAM, that adding the A to those important cluster of subjects. There's a question was raised, or a comment was made around the mismatch between school types and the grade 9 examination exit point. There's a recognition that not all schools have a tight alignment. In fact, most schools don't have a tight alignment between the exit exams, the proposed new exit examination, and the school types. So we need to think about what we can do to ensure that there is an alignment between those 2 processes. Sorry, this is a little smaller. Okay, so let me go to some of the, these are other themes that emerged. There was the issues of language in the foundation, prioritizing foundation phase ECD belonging in the Department of Basic Education. There was a clear point about that. ICT and 21st century schools, we recognize that we need to incorporate those as part of the basket of skills, including foundation phase skills around reading. There's a great deal of discussion about the foundation phase and the need to incorporate ICT in the foundation phase, to focus on training of teachers in home language in the foundation phase. And there was a really important point that I think many people who are based in Johannesburg have around agricultural as a subject. We tend to ignore the subjects that are not necessarily central to the curriculum in the urban centers. The final point, and I'll just go back I need to thank our chair for making a very important intervention, because one of the tasks that we were required to do was a prioritization tasks. So we basically asked everybody to put their hands up and say, which priority is their number one priority? And then what emerged quite interesting was that some things were far more important than others. The most important for the group involved in the curriculum was reading. It was by far the single most important priority for everybody in the curriculum group. That was followed by differentiated curriculum, although there is some disagreement on exactly what that might mean, or whether there's been misunderstanding of it. And language and ECD are followed third, equally tied as important. So we've got a pretty good sense that for this group of people in the sector, leaders in the sector, language, reading, ECD are critical to go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Bram. So the question that was asked of me over the lunch table was, so given the conversation in the task team, right, in the thematic group, what are the 2 or 3 game changers that come out of your conversation going forward now?
So, I mean, I think just looking at that list, there's a recognition, and I certainly from work that we've been doing with the Department of Education, we now have substantial empirical evidence of approaches that can improve early grade reading, both in the home language and in English first additional language. Clearly, as a basis, is a precondition for improving the entire system, that's it. It's no doubt that it's not going to solve all the problems, but it is the foundation upon which substantial improvements across the entire system. And it's also critical from a social justice perspective. So children are often not able to use the school system effectively as an opportunity to change their lives because they're stymied at the early stages of the system. So whether it's ECD or reading in the foundation phase, those are 2 areas which clearly need to be prioritized in order to ensure that we are able to build on them across the entire system.
I know that my vote wasn't counted, but it seems as if language is the real elephant in the room of all of this.
So I think the language issue, and again, I'd like other people from the floor to assist us, but there's a recognition that the old debate is stale and unuseful. There's a recognition that we must have home language and we must have English. That's not an issue. For the majority of children, those are absolutely essential. There's a recognition now that the quality of teaching in home language is central to realizing the project of education quality. So we're moving away simply from a question of schools and school governing body choices to understanding that language is primarily a teaching and learning issue, and that we must focus explicitly on improving the quality of teaching in languages as an important part of our national project.
Ngiyabonga kakhulu. Can I invite from the thematic group, if there's anyone who feels this report does not resemble what happened in the thematic work group, if there's something that was missed by Bram? All right, can I then invite our general audience? Bram? Can we just invite the general audience, if there are any questions or comment that you have? I think we can take 3 of those if they are sharp, and if there are things that you find missing in this overview. Yes, please, ma'am. Have we got a microphone? Okay. Are there any other hands? 2 more hands if needs be. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. I hope my comment isn't unfairly leveled, but it's to do with the question of language and literacy and the recommendations that I've seen coming from schools and also from some teachers is that we're actually quite static, not only in the debate we're having about language, but the way we divide them into subjects and the way we deal with literacy as something that is confined specifically to things between English and Afrikaans and Xhosa and that kind of thing, rather than as a hybrid model in which learning takes place through several languages, and where, for example, even if teachers are not equipped to teach in the language of learning and teaching, they're equipped with strategies to help learners co-learn with each other, to learn in languages that they've learned, for example. So in one example that I've seen, there was a teacher who had about 5 or 6 languages present in her classroom, and peers actually assisted each other in the process of learning the language, with the end goal being to acquire English as the language of instruction. What sort of attention is being given to very dynamic strategies of using languages of learning and teaching in the classroom, not necessarily in terms of what the policy says about distinct languages as classroom languages, but rather as literacy as an ongoing, very dynamic process of engagement between peers.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other hands. So.
Okay, so I think the spirit of your comment, I think, was taken up very seriously by the curriculum group. The recognition that the kind of simple policy questions are not really the issue. It's about pedagogical strategies and improving instructional programs that is absolutely critical. And that's where the kind of translanguaging, the movement, what used to be just simply called, what was the phrase that we used? The code switching. We need to have more sophisticated and evidence-based approaches that really capture the more complex ways in which young people use language. So I think the spirit of your comment was certainly something that was raised by a number of the people within the curriculum group.
Thank you very much. Another round of applause. Thank you. Can I invite our governance thematic group? Are we ready? Okay, we're ready.
Afternoon, everyone. For those of you who were expecting Wendy and Goma, my name's Anne McLennan, and the reason I'm here is because I typed. So next time I'm not going to. She just looked at me and I got up and walked. So we had very robust discussion in both the roundtable and this discussion on governance. And the broad overall conclusion, I think, is that there's not much real sort of in-depth or dramatic policy change that needs to be made in relation to governance. Quite a lot of it is in terms of interpretation and implementation. The big 3 issues that were raised was firstly the powers and functions of the governing body, and this was an extensive and detailed and quite contested discussion, and in particular around the composition of the governing body, you know, co-opting members, should members have voting rights. There were a whole range of issues related to that. Then there was a set of issues that I've clubbed together and called intergovernmental relations, but they refer to the, hello Jonathan, they refer to the discussions up and down the system. So from school to circuit to district to province and back down again, and noting in particular that there's quite a lot of fragmentation and actually very little flow and collaboration between those different levels. So system governance is a challenge, And some of the specific things where it relates to school governing are around the distribution and placement of teachers, which is why admissions policy, I think, is being looked at in the ANC policy document. And then there are a whole range of things in relation to that over which governing bodies, in fact, although they have the fiduciary responsibility, have no control. So remuneration of teachers, school service fees, etc. The other issue is the whole issue around concurrent powers and the extent to which the hierarchy predominates rather than the collaboration, and in particular around the tendency to need a kind of universal standard, a national standard, and then to be able to accommodate provincial diversity and needs. And this is particularly a challenge because one of the primary causes around inequality in relation to governance is quite often actually the spatial and socio-economic structural distribution, which is obviously very difficult to shift. And then also a discussion around provinces' powers and resources, particularly in terms of providing support to schools through districts. As we all know, I mean, there's lots of acting going on in either acting or vacancies in districts, and that kind of support process is often not easily available. And then the third clump of issues was around norms and standards for school funding and local realities. And I know that overlaps a bit probably with the resources section, but the key issues in relation to SGBs is around quintiles, and sort of, you know, you might end up being a quintile 2, but in fact most of your kids come from a local informal settlement, and you should actually be a quintile 5. That kind of thing. Also around fee exemptions, which in very well-resourced schools is okay, but lower middle class schools end up carrying the cost of fee exemptions because parents in those schools actually can't pay the additional fees. And then the issue of debt. There was also discussion around sharing of facilities and resources and skills. You know, how do you get two schools, two governing bodies, etc., to get together and share? And the issue of school feeding schemes was also, it's related to the quintile issue, but also about extending it. Okay, so this is called maybe some policy recommendations, because very few are actually real on policy issues, we think. And there's another section which is on not policy recommendations as well. So one of the things that comes out clearly is do not change the powers and functions of governing bodies. That was very loud and clear from the broad spectrum of people in the round table. The only thing that might be considered is extending the term of office of governors to 5 years. And one of the reasons for looking at the issue of terms of office is that very often 3 years isn't enough. People just getting experience and then they have to leave. But also in relation to that, there's the issue of, you know, your child leaves school while you're in the middle of a term, and some thought, the group thought some thought need to be given about how those people could actually stay on and provide support based on their experience, maybe as co-opted members, or maybe not. But that some idea needs to be given to that for two reasons. One is so that they can finish their term of office, but the other one is to make sure we keep capacity in the system. And then finally, in relation to that, was to look at the powers of co-opted members, and this was highly contested, and there was absolutely no agreement. But the idea is, if you're going to co-opt people sort of from the community, or business leaders, or past pupils was one suggestion, traditional leaders, that if they were going to sort of volunteer their time, then perhaps they should have voting rights. The counter argument was that actually it's parents who should be making the primary decisions, and if you have too many co-opted members, then you erode that parental power. So we left it at have a look at those powers. And then around the norms and standards, and apologies if this is a repetition, but one of the things we thought, because governing bodies do manage school fees, that there might be a way, and it may not need a policy change, maybe it can be done in terms of the existing legislation, is to find a way to manage school fee increases. So at a minimum, they cover increased costs, whether it's related to salaries, etc., but that they can't shoot up the fees by an additional 10% or something over that, making it unaffordable for a set of kids in the school. The other one was to lobby SALGA as a whole system for reduced rates on services. I'm not quite sure how that works in terms of local government and those kinds of things, but school feeding scheme to high schools was another suggestion, and then maybe to put in place some guidelines around sharing resources, so fields, etc., that could do that. And then a final set of issues around rules for both in-school succession planning. So one of the big issues was around the deputy principal and how the deputy principal gets to learn about being an ex officio member of a governing body, and who stands in and can they sort of watch what happens, etc. As well as a staggered handover for new SGBs. So one of the suggestions about the sort of cutoff is that we stagger the handover so that you're not losing your capacity all in one go. You know, so you finish that and then you have to start over again. And then the not policy recommendations are in three broad areas. So one is sort of democratization or system governance. And one of the suggestions there is to establish the NETC, that it's provided for and should be in, and partly because they think that actually allows for a broader scope of stakeholders than are currently there in other forums. To enable provincial support to schools. So one of the suggestions is, for example, you know, maybe provinces or even the National Department could set aside, or maybe it's the NECT now that I think about it, but set aside funding for innovation, governance innovation, to facilitate sharing and those kinds of things. The terms of office we've spoken about, and the issue of co-option we've spoken about. But there was quite a strong emphasis on actually using co-option to be more inclusive and to start to shift the whole kind of uneven skills distribution to favor poorer or less resource schools. There was a huge set of issues which around capacity building. Capacity building of governing bodies, of school principals and SMTs, of the community that supports schools, and of officials in the system. So there was a general sense that the policy actually is pretty much fine as it is, but what we haven't done is enable people to actually use that policy very effectively, and current SGB capacity building in particular is sort of uneven across provinces and sometimes inadequate or too technical. So we need to be more innovative in terms of how we do it. And then the other issue is to focus on the whole SGB. The tendency is to focus on parents, and then you don't build the school governing body in its totality as a team and enable them to work together, to build leadership in governing bodies, principals, and school management teams. This was a very interesting one, is to build a broader community understanding of school governing bodies and how to support them. So not necessarily to have, you can co-opt some community members onto the governing body, but the main issue is that actually you create awareness in the community, and that might provide more support. Innovative programs I've spoken about. Big issue around language is that policy should be translated, in particular into a couple of key languages, so that governing bodies can read it in their own language, and also that training might also need to not be in English, which it primarily is. And then the role of labor, there's one very quick one. And then the last one is around clarification, and that's really just to maybe put in place some regulations around the recruitment process, and particularly how the governing bodies, what their role is in that, so that there's a clear way and it can't be abused by various players, around governance, management, and leadership responsibilities, the school governing body transition process, which we spoke about, co-option, which we spoke about, succession plans. And then the final thing is also somehow to create awareness that if you use the existing regulations, there's quite a lot that you can actually do in terms of managing non-compliance.
Thank you very much. Warm round of applause. There must be one thing that preoccupied the thematic group most.
The powers and functions of governing bodies.
And within there, the specific issue that troubled you the most?
It was that the powers should not be adjusted as recommended in the ANC policy document, particularly admissions and recruitment.
Okay, we're all together on that one, right? Or at least we heard it, right? Okay, thank you very much. So, can I then invite members of the thematic group who engaged in this conversation to inform us as to whether there are issues that are not reflected adequately or not reflected at all in this overview? Can I invite colleagues from that side? Anyone from the thematic group? No one? You happy with this report? You happy with the report? All right, let's then invite the general audience amongst us. Are there any questions that you have of clarity or an issue that you feel was simply missed completely by the group? Yes, we have a hand right there in the middle. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Brooke. No, my question is based on the norms and standards in terms of funding. We are talking about the quintiling, and 1 to 3, they are regarded as the no-fee schools, and 4 and 5 are the fee schools. Now, there is a contradiction there in terms of when you look into the budget of these two streams or these two schools, it is a little bit unfair to the other. Why? Because the other ones are able to make supplementary requisition from parents, and the other one is restricted through policy to say that you cannot request any additional amount. So what I'm appealing and requesting now is, let us say because we understand the background and we understand the inequalities and the injustices that prevailed before. So the government itself was trying to cap that particular situation. Now, what we are requesting is say, let us say the maximum requisition that can be made in terms of development fund, let it be 200 rand per year. That is the submission. I thank you.
Okay.
Is that 200 rand per student per year, per pupil per year? Okay, so let's make a note about that. I'm not sure if there are any further inputs. Yes, please. There's a microphone.
Did the group actually discuss equity in relation and equities in relation to governance? Because it seems like quite a technical document that's being presented here. And I think Jonathan in the plenary was talking about the fees and the inequities, the private income. So was there any discussion about any of these recommendations dealing with equities and inequities as a result of the governance arrangements and how you mitigate or reduce those?
So that's the second one, and then the last one, if there's any, please. You should feel free to call on your compatriots and comrades.
I think another question is whether or not the issue around public-private partnerships did come out in relation to governance. I think that came out in the very first presentation. It's one of the very contested issues in South Africa currently.
Are you from the Western Cape? Just check.
No, I'm not. Hey,
Or-
I am from KZN though.
Okay, just teasing you, don't worry. So we got three very pertinent issues that were raised, and I invite any comment on those.
I mean, I think the first one was a comment really, and we should note it. There wasn't any discussion in relation to PPPs, actually, surprisingly, now that I think about it. And can I defer the inequality one to you, Wendy? Can someone give Wendy a... Wendy's our convener. I'm giving her the tough one.
Hi, thanks, and thanks for presenting for the group. Not deeply address the issue of equity. However, there was reference to it in terms of how the, should I say, the spatial boundaries continue to perpetuate the apartheid structures. And therefore, there was a view that if we are to transform the system and address issues of equity and equality, we may then also start thinking about those special boundaries. And if we are creative enough, it means then within those special boundaries, we begin to twin schools that can work together. And if anything, probably it was in the other forum, again, where we were actually asked to even think about how we align ourselves with the current municipal demarcations, so that the schools now begin to function in line with the new boundaries that have been demarcated, to an extent of saying, you know, a rich school in Sandton can still work with a school in Alex, or using the same boundaries that we now know as depicted by local government.
Yeah, the round table much more discussed the issue of how policy in general seems to entrench race and class inequality. And maybe this looks more strategic because we're trying to find a way through that. And the primary way through that was seen to first of all, to build capacity, because that's something you actually can change and act upon. You can build institutional capacity so that people can operate in spite of their socioeconomic conditions. And the second of all was to facilitate sharing of some kind.
Thank you very much. Round of applause. Siyabonga kakhulu. So, Minister, you may want to later comment on this issue of more bureaucratic administrative versus collaboration. within the intergovernmental system of basic education. You willen Muslim. Thank you very much. Thanks so much to the colleagues. Can I invite our colleagues who worked on resourcing to share with us their insights? No. He was supposed to be first.
Thank you very much, Chair, or Budzwai, as is known to those of us from the Eastern Cape. Yes, I'm reporting on the resourcing discussion. This was the least popular of the working groups. We had a very small attendance, but we have had a rich and wide-ranging discussion nonetheless. Being a cross-cutting issue, we felt particularly disadvantaged in the sense that we would have preferred a situation in which we could have had the inputs and the resolutions from all the other groups and tease out what the resourcing implications were that they were suggesting and then work on what we needed to do. We didn't have that luxury, so we've anticipated some of these issues, and we focused on a few large questions. While the discussion was wide-ranging, I think I want to steer us into three broad questions that we looked at. One was the adequacy of the resourcing envelope overall and the debates around that. Secondly was the distribution of those resources between national and provincial, and then between the provinces and between schools. And then a whole series of subsectoral issues in which we looked at the efficiency of the resource utilization. And I think that's one of the key questions or insights coming through out of the discussion in the group. In terms of the amount of resources, I think that our input paper argued the case that on the face of it, when you do some international comparisons, it's very hard to make a coherent case for a larger allocation of resources to the schooling system, just in comparative terms. The same doesn't apply necessarily to higher education, where I think it's much easier to make that case. But by comparison, both with countries at comparative levels of development and others, we are spending a significant proportion of resources relative to GDP on schooling. One of the key insights emerging was that there were more issues to be looked at in terms of the distribution of that allocation. And I think the outcome of that discussion, by way of recommendation, is to say a lot of the debate has been focusing to date on the distribution of the national cake through the equitable share formula. But I think the group has come to the conclusion that it's equally important to look at the size of the cake relative to the overall split between national resources and what goes into the provincial pool. So we're saying there's an issue to be examined by way of what's the size of the overall budget allocation made available as a provincial pool before that is split between the 9 provinces. There was also a sense that certainly the educational share of the equitable share formula by and large distributed resources on what could be called an equitable and fair basis, but that the overall impact of the national share formula, the equitable share formula, and additional resource issues had the effect of inequitable distribution on the ground. And there certainly was a case made for much more detailed examination of the differential cost structures particularly with regard to, and I think the term we want to use is not rural provinces, because I think that term rural obfuscates the difference between provinces that have a rural socio-economic condition and those that house large ex-homeland components. So I think we're creating a special category of saying those provinces that have significant tribal trust land, rural, tribal village components that they service, have significant additional cost pressures. The cost of provision on a per capita basis is much higher because of low density and the proliferation of small schools with half empty classrooms. And that the share formula needs to take a second look at this and find ways of assigning resources in somewhat different proportions going forward. Then we picked up on a whole series of additional issues that we came out in our base document. One, that the overall allocations towards schooling have been decreasing slightly when enrollment has been increasing in almost all of the provinces. There are some provinces where enrollment is not increasing as fast. And I think we also pointed to the reduction in the buying power of the education budget over this period. Also that the equitable share formula has to take into account, or the distribution of resources needs to take into account migration patterns, particularly in the context of increasing urbanization. And I think in the group there was some discussion and I think some agreement on the fact that intra-rural transfers of learners have negative impacts both sides. So where learners are moving to the Western Cape or Gauteng or elsewhere, that has the impact of course, increasing the service delivery load of those provinces, and that has to be catered for. But the provinces that the learners move from have the effect of the per capita allocations or per capita costs of the remaining learners increasing because the density goes down. And so you have more and more small schools with more and more small classrooms, and you're spending more and more on teachers on a per capita basis. And so the effect is negative for both donors and the recipients of inter-provincial migration. A large part of our discussion focused on the fact that if we weren't able to argue for too many more resources, and we had all of these areas that needed additional resource allocation, the sector as a whole needed to spend a lot more time and energy and effort on studying the question of the utilization of resources and increasing value for money, and looking at how the resources are spent and the return on that. And a strong argument for a targeted approach in that sense. There was also a very strong recommendation that one examines in broad terms a much more fundamental utilization of ICT technologies, data across the education sector. And again, that was pointed to the fact that a lot of the progress that has been made in this regard in some of the provinces has essentially been funded outside of the equitable share formula, where the provinces involved have huge additional resources, reserves, from own revenue and elsewhere that they've been able to bring to bear. There was a lot of discussion on grade R and a strong push across the board for and this came out in the earlier plenary, norms and standards for the provision of grade R, and we were reminded that the ruling party in fact has a commitment to grade R2 or grade 2R. We were supposed to be introducing 2 years of pre-primary education, and we're battling with year 1. Again, in terms of the focus on the utilization of resources, I think the argument was that whilst we haven't been able to fully roll out and professionalize that sector, the early evidence is not all that glowing in terms of the contribution of the expenditure on grade R to date on improvements in performance in foundation phase. There hasn't been a significant flow through as yet in terms of the early assessments of improved learning outcomes in grade 1, 2, and 3, in particular for those learners in poor schools where attendance in grade R makes almost no difference at the moment in terms of performance in the foundation phase. That may well have to do with other factors that need to be looked at in a bit more detail. There was an unclear relationship identified between the resource allocations and outputs. I think that's the general point that we've been making, that we're spending a lot of resources. A lot of that is going on staff allocations and related expenses, and we haven't sufficiently been able to track value for money over time in that regard. Some other issues there was a debate around the changes that have taken place in the private schooling sector, and in fact there was a much larger discussion around changes taking place across the board. I think there was some point around the unfortunate development around the bifurcation of the quintile system into essentially grade 1 and 3 in one group, and then 4 and 5 in the other. And there was some argument that there have been significant changes that have not been sufficiently monitored or factored into adjustments to the policy process. In terms of quintile 5 schools, or at least the fee-paying schools, the exponential increases in the fee payments or the fee charges over the last decade, which has multiplied the quantums of resources under management in these institutions, to the extent that some of them are better financed and better resourced than many schools in the independent sector. Then, in terms of the independent school sector, there was an argument that even at that level there's been significant changes. Whereas the independent sector before had a kind of a fly-by-night allocation at the lower end of poor quality private schooling and an Ivy League component at the top. Over the last 5 to 6 years, we've seen a significant development in the middle of those two extremes in terms of the development of lower cost, higher quality independent schools. I think the overall recommendation from the group is that one needs to re-examine the relationship or the articulation between the independent and the public school sector. And that wasn't necessarily an argument in favor of the developments in the Western Cape. But it was a recognition that we needed to engage in the sector without dogma, and we needed to try and be open to innovative approaches in order to extract the greatest benefit for the general public school system. Better support for learners with special needs, that was a very strong appeal coming through as well, and that's related to the question of norms and standards that have not been sufficiently. There's some work that has been done, we're assured of, but there's a very strong sense that before we take on any more additional commitments, we need to ensure that sufficient resources are targeted at learners with special needs. That's a very brief summary, Chair.
Thank you very much. Warm round of applause. Fees must fall. No, he's talking about the fee increases over the last decade in certain schools, right? So, the one thing that preoccupied you in particular, that you really struggled to resolve?
I think there was a lot of debate around the distribution of resources between provinces and the situation of provinces with large homeland components. And I think there was also a lot of discussion around the inequity across different categories of schools in terms of the resource base available to them.
It's interesting, in the university sector, just 3 years ago, Minister, your colleague adopted a new policy on the funding of universities that sets aside something like 600 million rands a year, if I have it right. So top slices the national allocation by 600 million and allocates that on a project basis to the 8 historically black institutions. So just a thought for you. So can I invite then colleagues who are part of the team here? Are there things that Jonathan here misrepresented or failed to tackle?
Just to say, some of the debates were unresolved even in the group, so I'm sure there may be some slightly different nuances that people may want to share.
And it is that, or those that I invite, it is self-evident that there's a chief whip in that group. Yeah, Chair of the Portfolio Committee will notice that so far we have had 3 group presentations and nobody from the groups jumped up and said, I call. So thank you very much. So can we then invite from the general audience, colleagues, are there things that you feel were not adequately covered, at least in the overview, or issues that you feel should be put on the table, please? Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to, actually this one I want clarity in terms of Section 21 of South African Schools Act, in terms of provisioning of textbooks, purchasing, and so forth. So why are we centralizing that provision and procurement for LTSM? Because in terms of what is written here, that is the capacity of the AGBs, and also it can be withdrawn if that particular SGB lacks capacity and it is ineffective. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just hold that. Can I invite up to 2 more inputs? I see one right at the back, and then right here in the middle. We can start at the back, please.
Chair, thank you. I just want to check from the Commission, particularly in those schools that are no-fee schools, even though the department does give them grants, but it is ring-fenced. Did you perhaps discuss issues around sports? Because that also become, if schools have to develop learners holistically, they cannot tap into what has been ring-fenced, and yet there are no fee and there's nothing that comes to the school. What has been your thought around sports and also development of staff around that issue? Thank you.
Thank you. In the middle here. Are you just stretching your arm? Huh?
Thank you very much. Just would like to rather make a comment on the fact that every conversation I hear about resourcing in education starts with this problematic trope of amount of GDP we spend. And it's a really problematic measure because it doesn't tell us how many mouths the pie has to feed. It doesn't tell us the distribution of the population and whether that is a percent that matches a younger population versus an older population. Education is always going to be higher for youthful populations, health always for older populations. GDP is an absolute amount, not a relative expenditure. Even GDP per capita, there's a really strong literature that shows using percent of GDP as a measure of whether you're spending enough or too much or too little, it's not the right place to start. But we hear it in the radios, we hear it in forums, we hear it in SGBs. South Africa spends so much of its GDP on education. I think it's shaping our social imagination about our education system in a very negative way because we're constantly thinking that what we're doing is we must have enough in the system. But if you've actually worked in a quintile 1 to 3 school, you can clearly see that the resources are not enough. But that argument falls flat against this thing about GDP all the time. So just to flag that up as a problematic starting point. Sure. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, my point is on the issue of language. I think earlier on, it was discussed that language is a critical resource, especially the issue of code switching. And I haven't heard the group, talking about the language issue. Was it deliberate or?
All right, Jonathan, please, if you could.
Thank you.
But before that, Convi, I said I'm going to ask you this question. So should we not just collapse the so-called Model C, or the top 20% of schools, since they charge so much in terms of fees? Shouldn't we just collapse them into the independent school sector?
I'm not sure as to whether I understand the question.
So the question that we discussed over lunch was, this dual system, one for the middle class within the public school sector system, and one for quintile 1, 2, and 3, and maybe even quintile 4. And the question was, shouldn't we just give up on this idea of keeping the middle class in? You remember the question?
No comment.
You may want to comment on that, Jonathan.
Yes, I actually would like to comment, if I can start with. I think there are various proposals floating around that. There's at least one proposal suggesting that one may want to temper the extent to which those fees have grown by introducing a staggered compulsory no-fee quota, so that schools that exceed a particular fee at a particular level would be required to automatically enroll a 5% no-fee learners, and they would need to go and find those learners on their own.
5%
and so
sounds
on.
too low, man. 5% sounds too low.
Okay, so there are a whole series of proposals around it. But let me just respond to the questions and just correct an omission. It didn't come through in the report. There was a strong recommendation and discussion around the role of increasing the control of school principals over their budget allocations and management of budget, as well as increasing the extent of the information school principals have available on provincial expenditure in their schools. And that went, of course, along with the discussion around improving selection, preparation, certification of school principals, but that by and large, more authority needed to be vested in the schools to manage the resources available. The first question was around Section 21 schools, and strangely there was no debate at all within the group on this question. So I'm not able, I can give you a personal view, but I'm not sure that that's relevant here. The central procurement question. Yes, and I think the central procurement question was supported by and large on the basis of efficiency and cost savings and the ability to direct the resources to cover other critical gaps, in particular in those parts of the system that are sparsely funded. In terms of no-fee schools, and the colleague mentioned provision for sport in particular, but I think one could add a whole series of things to that, cultural activities, and a whole series of other things. And I think that related to the input this morning, that the norms and standard allocation is a very basic allocation and doesn't enable schools to engage in all that recovery of disadvantage that people have inherited. And so that question, I think, remains of what do we base the norms and standards allocation on when we are saying these schools are not allowed to raise any additional resources from parents, and elsewhere the amounts of revenues raised are astronomical. And so if these schools are ever to be able to improve their facilities, introduce sporting facilities, sporting practices, cultural activities, all these other weird and wonderful things that enrich learning and so on, then we're a long way off from that in terms of that. The argument on GDP, I think we can't argue with. And I think it's always helpful to present the GDP figures alongside with the percentages of expenditure of the overall budget. And I think when you look at both of those, the situation doesn't change that much. These are always political questions. And we've made a political commitment to education as an apex priority. If we are true to that, then we may be willing as a society to buck the international trend and go for much larger proportions. That decision has not been made, and I think the only thing we were pointing out in the working group is if you do a comparison at the moment, that argument is hard to make. There's nothing precluding this gathering, however, from making a very strong recommendation in that regard. On the language issue, we didn't really deal with that question. We assumed that would be dealt with both in curriculum and in teacher development. So we really don't have anything to say on language.
Thanks very much. Much
Thank you.
appreciated. Seba.
Thank you.
I must say that some of the parents who come to our universities from these schools, public schools, Minister, they feel that they get a discount when they come to university. University's typical tuition fee is 30,000 to 35,000. Obviously, you've got some universities that ask 55,000, but even that 55,000 is sometimes at a discount to the public schooling price in some of our schools. So I now invite our colleagues from the team on rural education. We'll take your hand at the end, ma'am.
Thank you, Chair. I am Sekitla Mahasan. So I will be presenting from the thematic area of rural education. I just need to say thank you very much to all the colleagues from that commission. There are quite a number of issues that were raised, but as you know, we are not going to present all of them here. We just took out the main issues as required. But as I have seen the way in which the chair is conducting this session, at a later stage, you will have chance to say or to raise some of the issues that you think they are important, but they have been omitted in this report. So this is how we have structured this report. After we have discussed different issues, we sat down and we decided to take the main issues. Those issues that we are saying they have impact on rural education or education in rural areas. I will come to that issue at a later stage. First of all, this is how we have structured our report. For the purpose of clarity, we mention the policies that we think are going to have impact on rural education. From there, we take each policy, then we discuss those issues. Immediately after that, then we mention some recommendation. But when I conclude this presentation, then I'm going to mention the general recommendations. But before I start my presentation, I have to say that rural education or education in rural schools, there are multiple challenges that affect education in that context. And we think they are unique. That is why, therefore, we are saying, let's look at those policies and highlight those issues that we think are pertinent. These are the policies that we have identified. We have identified a number of policies, but these are the ones that we are saying we are going to discuss in this report. The PPN, the policy on rural incentives, and as I discussed the policy on rural incentives, I'm going to touch on the program on Funza Loshaka program. Norms and standards for school funding, multi-grade teaching, and classrooms. Then I move to the next step where I mention a policy and then the issues that are raised with regard to that particular policy. PPN, so what we have said and what we think affects rural schools more than schools in other contexts is that this policy is cost-driven as opposed to learner needs-driven. So from the onset, we need to say that there is this principle that is adopted in South Africa, or the philosophy of Batopele, people first. But if you look at this policy, it is undermining that principle. What is important from this policy is cost, not the needs of the people. You have I will just take you one example. The schools are allocated, rather, teachers are allocated the schools according to learner enrollment, the number of learners that each school will have, regardless of the number of subjects that those schools are providing. So if we have those small schools in rural areas with few learners, it means the education establishment is not going to enable them to offer quality education to those learners because there are going to be fewer learners. So in that regard, it is more about the cost than the needs of the learners. So what we are saying that we need to have a policy that is going to affect, or that is going to address those contextual issues, not one size fits all kind of a policy. The PPN model should be revised to take into consideration rural context. Let's move on to another policy, norms and standards for school funding. We are saying this also affects small schools, and most of these schools are in rural areas. The funding for schools is also based on learner enrollment. So if there are fewer learners, then it means less funding. And if there is less funding, then it means those schools will not be in the position to pay for what they require in order to provide quality education. But there are also some strings attached with regard to the funds that are allocated to schools. 60% is supposed to be spent on LTSM, and 40% on non-LTSM. So we are saying if it is not flexible, then it is restricting the schools. What if the school, for example, does not want to spend money on LTSM this year? Or rather, let's put it this way. Already, there are enough teaching and learning materials of which the school does not think that there is a need to spend money on that. What is going to happen? There is another issue which affects schools with regard to funding. It might affect all other schools, but it's affecting rural schools more. The learners without ID documents are not funded. If you have learners with ID documents and you have submitted the list to the department, once they are identified, then it means you are not going to get funding with regard to those particular learners. Thank you very much. But we might as well say most of such learners will be found in rural areas. Hence, we are saying this affects rural areas more than other schools. So we recommend that there should be a new funding model which is going to consider small schools. Another policy is with regard to rural teacher incentives. As we were discussing, it emerged that this policy is implemented unevenly. You will find that you have schools in rural areas. One schools where teachers get incentives, but there is a neighboring school, maybe just across the road, where teachers do not get those incentives. So the policy is not, there is no uniformity in terms of implementation of the policy. And we also need to say that we are of the view that financial incentives are not enough to retain teachers in rural areas. There are also other needs which can be addressed. So the policy needs to take into consideration other things that can be done in order to retain teachers or to attract teachers to teach in rural areas. So we recommend that when it comes to incentives, let's have more than monetary incentives. We can talk about teacher accommodation. You can have bursary schemes specific for teachers who are working in those contexts. You can also have professional development opportunities for those teachers, because it also emerged that the policy demands that there should be continuous professional development for teachers. But then if these teachers are in deep rural areas where there are no institutions that are offering professional development, then it becomes a problem. So we are, let's come to broad recommendations. In my language, we have a saying that kopano ke matla, unity is strength. So this is closely related to that issue of about principle. So what we are saying is some of the challenges, you will find that they can be addressed by other departments as opposed to Department of Education. So in order to address these challenges, there is a need for interdepartmental collaboration. So let's take the issue of transport, for example. If the Department of Education wants to provide learners with transport, but there are no roads, then access to other schools is not possible. But the Department of Education is not responsible for construction of roads. The issue of ID documents that we have mentioned, it is not the responsibility of the Department of Education to ensure that learners have ID documents. So there's a need for all departments to work together to deal with these issues. Last but not least, we realized that there's these policies. If you look at them, some of them we said they are not implemented well, others are not implemented at all. So there is a need for constant monitoring of policies and evaluation. Our policies should be evaluated and monitored. We should not take them like a Bible. I think with Christians, we don't amend the Bible. But with our policies, we need to make sure that we visit them every now and then. But there is one issue that I forgot with regard to rural education, where we said these policies, you'll find that when they are developed, then when it comes to that stage of piloting, in most cases they are not piloted in those rural areas. We look for schools that maybe can be monitored, which are close to Department of Education officials. So we are saying, if we have to address these challenges with regard to rural education, let's test all the policies in rural context. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Minister, you may also wish to comment on this idea that pilots are run there next to your office. Yeah. So the one thing that really had you upset in this group of yours, that really had you animated and engaged.
Yes, and then I think also this issue that I mentioned, I have also seen it maybe as a researcher also. The issue of rurality is still ill-defined. And then we had some debates there, but we did not want to go into the details about whether we are talking about education in rural areas or rural education. So there's a need to define what we mean by rurality.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Can I then invite from the thematic group of their colleagues who would want to address any particular issue here that's maybe not included that you felt strong about? If not, yes, please.
Just one point. Like all other areas, the team felt that school closure is also economic and cost-driven. And from the members of the group, it was clear that they are not for school closure because they mean a lot to rural communities. Sometimes if you close them, then it means you're destroying the entire community.
Okay. That's a tough one, but can we then invite other colleagues from outside the thematic group? If you've got any issue that you would wish to put on the table. I see one hand at the back and then one here. Please, we can start at the back.
Thanks, Prof. It's just a point of clarity on the group regarding the learners who do not have IDs and are not documented or recorded and therefore are not funded. I did not really get a recommendation per se from what was presented. It's just clarity on the challenge of learners who do not have IDs. And I think there's a policy, the CS policy, which should be implemented by all schools that looks at the screening, identification, assessment, and support. And that particular policy should be addressing this issue. Because I'm worried that once we also begin to advocate for learners who do not have IDs, what kind of fraudulent activities can also take place in the system, where a school could easily say, we have 50 learners while there aren't any 50 learners in the system. But it's just a clarity out there. Secondly, may I also just take this opportunity, Prof? I raised my hand before, I'm not going to speak again. It was just to clarify, Professor McLellan, from the governance group, the issue of the PPP, which was brought by the resourcing group, that was the link which we had raised in the group, that perhaps there should be an exploration of the innovative ways of supporting SGBs in schools, and I think that point links very well with resourcing as well as school governance, particularly for poor schools who do not have competency in the SGBs, as well as funding that is needed for the poor schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm sure all of the conveners have taken note of that point. Yes, sir.
Mine was just to perhaps, I don't know whether it's a question or it's an observation. When it comes to rural education, I don't know if we still remember that ministerial committee MCRE report in 2005. Parts of it made about 82 recommendations, and some of those recommendations have been taken up by provinces, like the one on incentives and the rationalization guidelines and all that came up. But I think the uneven implementation, especially in some of these, is that it's a bit of an oversight from the education department, I don't know, or from us, unless I missed the memo, that it was never really made a policy or which of the recommendations were actually taken. So perhaps somehow it might look like a very old report now, but a lot of those issues are still with us. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for raising that issue. We'll have one last hand, and then we have to press on. In front here.
Thank you. The first one will be a comment on the involvement of interdepartmental collaboration. For me, I think across all the discussions, and when you look, there is a sector that is important to education, which impacts on education, especially the local government. And I've not heard much of how can we make sure that local government, especially municipalities, when you look at our schools, in terms of electricity, in terms of water, the basic needs of the schools are controlled at that department, but there are no collaborations or discussions to assist schools, maybe if they are faced with challenges of service delivery. Hence, maybe we have all this that they tend to blow out of proportion. And the other thing, for me, I think we might be missing a point of excluding parents in our discussion, parental education. How do we educate our parents so that they understand that they are the primary teachers of the children before even the department can take responsibility? But how can we make parents to be accountable? How do we empower our parents so that they go back to the schools and make the principals of the schools to account in terms of how their children get educated? And also making sure that parents understand that education is not only about a matric certificate, but before, maybe along the way, there are some other exit opportunities that are available, but which are sometimes looked down at when you think about TVET, for an example, so that parents are supporting children in such a way that they don't take away the self-confidence and dignity of the child if the child does not do well in terms of the academics.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I think with regard to the issue of ID documents, from our group, I think we said this issue of collaboration between the departments or among departments is working well in Eastern Cape in terms of issuing of identification documents, where the department at that provincial level is collaborating with Home Affairs.
All right. If I think that the others were strong recommendations. Jonathan, you wanted to react?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make the point that the challenges and issues of rural schooling are not disconnected from our challenges in the creation and stimulation of the rural economy. We effectively have given up, I think, as a system, as a country, on a rural economic development strategy. And we seem to be content for our food production to come from commercial farmers, and our economic development strategy is driven by the urban centers, industrial, etc., etc. So in the Eastern Cape, we identify 3 tracks of population migration. There's the out-migration that everybody talks about to Gauteng and the Western Cape. There's the normal urbanization to the big urban centers around Port Elizabeth, East London, and Mthatha to a certain extent. But much more devastatingly is intra-rural migration, where people are remaining within the context of a rural district, but they're moving away from the deep rural areas into the small towns, into RDP housing, or along the major arteries. All of it a manifestation of absolute despair about the possibility of making a living in a rural context. And we, as a system, seem to be sending mixed messages around, on the one hand, extending and developing the roles and powers and functions of traditional leadership, and so on. So in that context, the problem of the proliferation of small schools is something that will accelerate over the next decade as urbanization increases, as all our economic stimuli push the urbanization process. So I'm just saying, you know, we can debate the issues, but unless we're able to link rural schooling to the creation or the sustenance of a rural economy, I think we're missing the boat. Thank you.
Okay. There are a few hands there in support. Shall we give... we've got to move on, Bram. I'm sorry, man. Support it. Support it. Thanks, Dad. Semo. So what was that about, the Bible or something? The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Shall we invite our colleagues to address us on their work in the teachers' thematic group? You got the drift, right? The last shall be first.
Oh, you did it, yeah? Got it, that's fine. Okay, that's great. Cool, thank you. Well, you could always say when it all comes down to it, it's all about the teachers and the learners in the classroom, whether it's governance, curriculum, resourcing. It's about teachers, which is why I think our discussion was quite wide-ranging. It was quite extensive, and we raised substantive issues of policy as well as serious matters of implementation concern. I think somebody in the room counted 40 people tried to speak. And so invariably, if you want a lack of consensus on what I'm going to say, this is the group where you're going to get reactions to it. But I think what happened over time is, as we evolved the discussion, we identified several areas, some which are more matters of policy tweaks, and some which are more matters of policy implementation. And what we did over time, and I'm just updating what's in the PowerPoint, is we then talked about the recommendations or policy option in relation to several areas: teacher professional development, teacher governance, teacher career pathing, and teacher incentives. So that's how we're going to address it. But I think it's important here, I think the group started off with a discussion that we want to endorse a vision of teachers. And our vision of teachers was about active teacher professional agency for transformation. We thought we needed to put that up front. And in that sense, what we're saying that teachers are probably the most important resource in effecting equity and quality, and thus they are core to what we do. So discussions of teacher salaries at 80% or 5% of GDP is useful, but must be rooted into how you maximize the one labor-intensive profession we have, which is education. It's about what happens with teachers and what teachers do. And I think that's our fundamental starting point. I think there was clear agreement that we don't need new policies, but really changes or tweaks, unless absolutely necessary. I think there was a sense, unlike Crane's count of 74, I think our count would suggest there's even something like 100 policies, you know, and 109. So we don't need new policies necessarily. It's about tweaking, and it's about revisiting some elements of policy which may require either regulationary change or amendments. So with that, we'll move to ideas that we said. I'm just trying to see, okay. We talked about that, so let's move to the next slides. What we did say is the ideas we're presenting are really ideas and policy options that need fleshing out. But on policy, we talked about several areas, and we tried to group the areas of thinking about them. One, I think there was both a policy and partly an administrative issue, is to strengthen a more rational and equitable system of teacher deployment and distribution. In other words, getting the right teachers in the right place and at the right time. And two things you can do. One is you might require minor tweaks to SASA and the Employment of Educators Act. At the same time, you need to revisit PPN, as several people said, so that it's sensitive to context and place, whether it's about rural teachers, whether it's about inclusive education teachers or ECD teaching teachers. It needs to be set, and it should also include support staff in schools. I think also one of the rational system is about how you position the NQTs. It's not about just supporting them, about what kind of conditions of service they labor under. Should they have 20% of time over a 3-year period to develop as teachers before they settled into practice? I think the second big thing we spoke about was develop and strengthen teacher support to and in schools. Again, this requires revisiting PPN to make sure the supported staff is right. And it might require resources for such support. The number of subject advisors might have to go up in some contexts. I think the governance group spoke about the vacancies of district advisors, subject advisors, etc. The third area we spoke about was revisiting initial teacher education. Both at the policy and also in implementation, this revisitation should include several things. Review of what vision we have about initial teacher education. We need to talk about policy change substantively in the foundation phase to ensure that institutions, when they train teachers for the foundation phase, train them in the language of instruction in the schools they're going to teach rather than as an additional language. We need teachers to be trained in isiZulu if that's what they're going to teach in, as opposed to adding isiZulu as an. We need to review the phases of training, whether there's too much of it, foundation, ISP, FET. Although it's curriculum aligned, there are curriculum implications. We need to think about what does the 3-stream curriculum means for ITE. Are we going to start training 3 tracks of teachers or not? What is the place of teaching practice? What is the challenge of recruiting the best into teaching? Actually, although the group, and this is I'm now speaking as the chair, we did do a survey of teachers, and surprisingly many people don't necessarily think of it as the last choice. They come in at it very positively. The question we ask is what happens to them during their 4 years and once they hit the school. We think that you need to strengthen the career pathing of teachers, which is partly an administrative but partly a policy change. Where there is the career pathing, you need to ensure there's support for implementing it, which has resource implications. We think that there should be a fundamental review of governance structures related to teachers. The role of SACE, is it the right structure? Does it have the right capacity? Does it have the right remit for doing all the things it does, whether that's ELRC? Because in ITE, It's a shared function between, if you like, SACE, ELRC, CHE, HEQC, DBE, and DHAT, coordinated by TPAC. Whether that's the right mechanism. So this is not about a policy change. This is about how the different divisions within education, if you like, work, but also across. We think that there might be a sensible thing to provide for a technical review of teacher education policies, the whole gamut as we're doing now, in order to find out what are the consistencies and inconsistencies between them. In other words, there's been a lot of policies over time, but clearly now's the time to do a sweep through all of them and see whether they hold or align. In relation to also what is happening in the ground. So this is where the policy element and the implementation element come together. We had a long discussion about teacher assessment. That is assessing teachers, not surprisingly. It's in the NTB and it's even in the NSIS policy document. But I think the key issue is important to link assessment with professional development and support. It's not assessment for the sake of assessment. In other words, similar to school-based assessment, you don't assess people simply to know what they do. You assess them to know what to improve and how to support them. We thought there were several cross-cutting themes across all the commissions. Resource is a key issue. And we think, as the resource group pointed out, you needed to see what we did in order to say what it is. We also think that SASA and governance is important. We think there's a revisit the frequency of elections, which pointed out. But we also think you need to revisit whether you should have one SGB per school. The assumption you should have 24,000 SGBs. Is it a tenable proposition, or whether you can have SGBs that cover a larger section of schools without becoming districts, obviously. SASA is crucial to the powers of recommendations of teachers and their appointments, but also crucial to the fact that the fee-paying schools are able to supplement the teachers above the norm by direct appointments. We know the history, we know why it came to be in terms of legal, but it is an issue because what you have is then the average teacher-pupil ratio norm declines in those schools substantially, and that's one of the things we're not really addressing. But also the appointments process, the additional funds leverage, allows you to provide a far more enriched curriculum in those schools than in any other schools, because that's the thing you cut when you have financial constraints. And so if you have additional resources, so we don't have an answer, but we certainly think that as governance and teachers. We also think from curriculum, we need to think about, in relation to the curriculum group, how do you empower teacher agency in curriculum? That was on the policy run-through. We don't have one bullet, a main idea, nor do we have some great new ideas, but we think some old ideas are worth revisiting. On administrative issues, we thought there were several we needed to think about. One is working conditions, which is more than just salary. It's about the conditions. It's violence against teachers or violence by teachers. It's about safety and security. There was a big discussion of it. We think there should be, as others said, a lot more about administration of incentives. They must not only become effective, but they must be meaningful and valued. They must target what matters. There's a whole thing about administration of bursaries. There's a whole thing about administration of teacher transfers and posting, and about adequate financial resources and support for the things we're saying, but particularly for the career pathing model, which tries to keep teachers in the classroom. If you cut that, then teachers look for other sources of promotion, like principals and deputies, and you lose the teachers you want in the classroom. So we think that there's a lot of interrelated policy issues which are really tweaks. They're not substantive that can be easily done, but there are also some administrative issues that need resolving. But collectively, we think fundamentally we were arguing for a system of education in general, but teachers in particular, in which we prioritize the attainment of equity and quality as the goal. Thanks.
All right, so you've preempted my question.
Yes.
So what were people most upset about in the...
In fact, we're upset about just everything. No. I don't know. I think I'd like to throw this back at the group because obviously I tried to synthesize it, but from my view, there's a fair degree of, if you like, I wouldn't call it upset, but frustration around how different good ideas and good policies, and a lot of them get differently mediated in local contexts. And it's how do you recover the best of devolved government against a broader vision of equity? I think Crane's presentation put it up this morning but did not resolve it. How do you create equity and quality in a decentralized national system of education? If you decentralize and have a national system, those are competing contradictions and tensions for us. And I guess what people are expressing is that they're at the coalface of this. So when somebody gets transferred in excess, it's the irrationality of the transfer that bothers you, even though the process is a rational one to do. So it's the fact that you sent a maths teacher to teach foundation phase, there's an irrationality to that. But the policy is quite clear on the sensible nature of transfers. It's like Funza Lushaka. It's a sensible policy to use it as a mechanism to get teachers where you want to, in how to teach. But, or the rural incentive, but districts, provinces, even schools reapply it. So it's that level of mediation.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for putting it
I
so
don't know, but
well.
I'd like my group to rather answer
Yeah,
that.
no, I'm
because-
worried that we're going to get 60 inputs from the
Okay.
floor.
But does that kind of answer it?
I think that's excellently put, you know, really well put, and I'm sure the minister has made notes about that as well. So at the risk of being shouted down, I'm not going to ask the group for other insights. Okay, I'll ask the group for other insights. Are there any insights, colleagues, from the teachers thematic group that you feel requires our attention? I've got 2 hands. Going, gone. Yes, sir, please. Ma'am.
Thanks, Aaron. Do we get a chance at the end of all of the inputs to make some comments, or these are only chance to make a comment?
This is our only chance.
Okay, so then I'm smuggling a bit, if you'll allow. So I think that there's several points that I want to make.
Can you just pick on 2 of them?
2, good, thank you. I think that while the education streams intersect in interesting ways, there's also interesting intersections with other elements of policy, some of which have been touched on and some of which haven't. So clearly with teacher ed, you can see the intersections with funding, etc. I think that the financial stream, as Jonathan said, had the greatest difficulty because it should build on that integration. But there's one element that they spoke about which came up in rural and which Jonathan picked up, which is this question of school closure and rural development. But there's another one, because you asked the interesting question about what should we do with Model C schools and shouldn't we make them private? But that was a conscious decision of the progressive movement to reject Model A, which is what that is, because of the role of public education in social cohesion. So I can't talk about that now, but that's my first point. The second point is that I think across all of the streams, including teacher, the teacher stream, is this complex area of the need for flexibility. It came through all the way, and it's clear in the teacher education. And I think that we should see this growing expression of a desire for flexibility as an expression of emerging maturity. Perhaps in the first 10 years, we needed to enforce a kind of conformity, a compliance, because we were creating a single system. But there were many unintended consequences of that inflexibility. And maybe what we need to now start doing is making sure that we have professional decisions driving the implementation of a policy framework on the basis of very clear principles, equity, equality, a rights-based framework, supported by very clear monitoring. And I want to just, and I promise you it's my last sentence, there's 2 examples. somebody spoke honestly about the fact that schools are charging fees, quintile 1, 2, and 3 schools. And they're making that decision on their own cognizance with support, but they need the flexibility to be able to charge the fees, but to ensure that children are not excluded as a consequence of the voluntary contribution. The other one, as an example, goes to the language issue, which is central to all of the debates. I've come across so many schools in rural Utungulu, Kinkatkwaya district, which are teaching English to first language isiZulu learners from grade 1. But there is no policy document that actually, there's no CAPS document for that. So there's many ways in which people are becoming more confident in our new democracy and need to have flexible policy frameworks for which they are accountable to implement. Thank you for letting me go for too long.
Thanks, Aaron. A very practical suggestion. The DPME has an evaluation framework that it goes into and plans a few years ahead. What I want to propose is that we take all the teacher-related legislation and policies, position that with the DPME and see whether there's an appetite to engage with an evaluation, a scientific evaluation, using M&E methodologies to looking at where we are as a country, particularly when it comes to teacher professionalization and also the legislation that underpins SACE. But broader, I think we agreed in the group around governance. I think there's a practical opportunity for us to lobby the DBE and the DPME to actually undertake something like this in the near future. Thanks.
Ngabonga. I don't see any other hands from. Remember now we are outside the group. We are outside the group. So how many hands at the back? One, and then one in front, and then we're going to close this out. Okay, I see you have been provoked, Confi. So we'll start at the back.
Just coming to the issue of teacher education and training, and I just want to ask a question to the meeting here today. If we look at education and the way education is trajectory following 1994, and we're wondering and we're researching and we're trying to find explanations for why we have not moved forward in terms of education in this country. And I asked or urge you please to engage a topic of discussion as to how we train teachers impacts what they do in schools every day that affects children's learning. I'm putting the question, can we consider the way we are teaching teachers that they are taking into schools and using in their classrooms? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm not sure if I missed this in the presentation, but given that there's a ruling party resolution on the reopening of teacher training colleges, or perhaps better frame the opening of new types of teacher training institutions, I'm wondering whether the group applied their minds to that question at all, and whether there are any views on non-graduate teacher training programs, particularly against the background of the looming crisis with foundation phase educators and so on. So just clarity.
No, thank you. Thank you, Chairperson. Let me just start maybe by making a few of you a little bit upset. I'm of the view that planning of education and all other programs, including the issues affecting the teachers, cannot be done without interrogating in a very intelligent way the validity of the country's balance sheet. The reason why I'm saying this is because as far as I'm concerned, the country's balance sheet is invalid. And the item that is missing from the budget of the Minister of Finance is the budget and expenditure for undocumented migrants.
if one were to just look at how much money we use, but we are not aware that we are using it, it is very impossible for us to be able to plan. So my proposal is that one of the ways in which this could be resolved is to engage with our peers in SADC to put in place a credible national population register, starting with South Africa, so that we can know where our learners are, where our teachers are, where the needs are. The biggest problem with having to deal with this issue is that when you start putting your teeth in it, it becomes or is interpreted as xenophobic. But the fact is, our balance sheet is incomplete, especially when it comes to social expenditure on education, on health, on social services, and on basic services like water, electricity. So we need to be able to give that a very serious thought. Now, the second issue which just came into my mind as we were talking about teachers is that our teachers are not with the learners in most instances, especially in the rural areas. So the alienation, one of the greatest impacts of implementation of policy since 1994 is that we have alienated communities from the education system and process, and that has got a very huge impact on the social construct of the South African society, because we have converted our children into commuters and we are denying them their childhood. They cannot walk to schools and they cannot play because they spend the mornings and the evenings in ventures on Mabopane Highway and on Kiluli's Exchange and on Soweto Highway, where they always clog the roads. Now, if we want to change, there is a need for us to radically change the way we see this so as to return the schools back to communities so that they are proud. We have got children who walk in the morning to the schools and they have got time to play and their children again. Thank you.
Radical education transformation. Radical education transformation.
Okay. All right. Look, I think those are very, very helpful comments, questions, and suggestions, and I think the Commission does need to think about it, and we have thoughts about some of those. I mean, I think few qualifications are necessary first. I think it would be very simplistic of us to suggest that there's a direct correlation between how we train teachers in an IT institution and what happens in schools. It's a complex thing because they operate in diverse contexts. And one of the things that we do know about teaching, particularly in the first year, is there's often a backwashing effect or an apprenticeship of observation for newly qualified teachers. They enter contexts that they're not familiar with, even if they had an opportunity of teaching practice there. So we must avoid too simplistic causal connection. That doesn't mean we can't do better on ITE. And one of the things we can do on ITE is first strengthen what is called the work integrated learning component or the teaching practicum. I actually counted the number of credits given to teaching practice across all the program. It's way too little in my view. It's a simple tweak. I think you need to increase it, but you also got to make it substantive and meaningful. In the research we did, 4 years of your teaching practice, you're actually only teaching once in your 3rd or 4th year. First 2 years you're spending around, wandering around schools, observing. I'm not saying you can't do teaching, it's about the real meaty experience. So those are internal implementation issue, which does bring me to the idea that I think in a democratic society, what we don't need is sending teachers into schools who are new graduates without qualifications. I don't think we need to pretend that we can't assume that teaching is a simple, the Teach First schemes, and I'm critical of those. Teach First, Teach America, Teach US. They actually make assumptions that you can send bright young graduates who actually in the long term don't stay in teaching, simply on the basis of motivation. What you do is you assume that teaching is a simple, straightforward task. It's actually a complex activity for which you need a good grounding in both theory and practice. It's never one or the other. I kept saying this in the group, you know, good theory is practice-based and good practice is theory-informed. I think this distinction, we must move away from it in ITE, which doesn't mean we can't look at alternative modes of teaching practice. And I think that can be whether we change the modality of when you do your teaching practice or whether you have a full year out. I think the colleges one, Jonathan, by the way, in the ANSYS discussion document, it doesn't talk about opening it. It talks about utilizing it for other purposes, which I think is good, which doesn't have to be about teaching only. It could be about vocational colleges, other kinds of things. So for me, that's important. I think it's absolutely important to review all the policies on teacher education, but I think we'd be making a mistake if we simply did it as a technical government exercise. We need the teaching profession involved. We need practitioners involved in the same way we involved in this commission, because one of the things that was coming out from the teaching commission was the absence of a dialogue forum that people engage in. So I don't think we can do that review in a technocratic way. It doesn't mean we don't need expertise, but it can't be done in a technocratic way because it's fundamental. So I think I would moderate the recommendation about handing it over to DPME or somebody like that. I think they can lead it, but it has to be genuinely rooted amongst the frontline implementers who are the teachers and the schools themselves. That will make sense in the policy because you need the feedback loop from the bottom up to understand what is working or not working. I think the last two things is, I think we have fundamental obligations about people who enter the country from wherever they are. And, you know, and I think we signed up international covenants about the rights of people who enter, and I think we have a right to provide education for them. I think the issue of commuter schools is a real problem. I think I agree with the comment. Fundamentally, the long march is the long march through improving public schooling in the most marginalized community. It's not about public-private partnerships or low-cost private schools, or it's not even about the increase in community schools. Those are symptoms of a fundamental problem. People choose to go to community schools because they feel and perceive that the local school's just not good enough. Our answer is therefore not to encourage community schools. Our answer is to make sure that we get the right teachers to those very schools and the right learning resources. And ultimately, it's a long march. It's not a short run. And no quick fixes, because we might find quick fix solutions in public-private partnerships or even handing over those schools to NGO organizations. But those are quick fix, and they might become part of the problem where even though they might be the solution in the short term. So for me, it is about fundamentally holding on to the idea of public schooling and improving it at the levels where it's most important. At the same time, recognizing that even those wealthier segment of schooling, they're coasting. You know, they are coasting. Those schools are coasting because of the cultural capital of the learners. So they're not doing anything better in that sense. And I think we must demystify the idea of their improvements. It's because often of the parents' base that we don't take. So for me, fundamentally, that is about equity.
Thank you. So, colleagues, there we have it. I know that we have strayed over time. I regret that. I'm clearly a very poor facilitator, very poor chairperson, and I ask your apology for that. But I hope at the same time that the 2 hours odd that we spent, 2 hours, 5 minutes or so that we spent together, is it 2 hours, 5 minutes? Yeah, something like that? That it provided us all a sense of the depth and the richness of the conversation. And we could have done it simply to say 10 minutes present, next 10 minutes present, next 10 minutes present. But the purpose of the post-commission conversation is really to see how these things fit or knit or don't fit or don't knit together. And I hope that I did watch you throughout the 2 hours, and I noticed that you were all engaged, 150 of you, all engaged in I did my count, you might have noticed. All of you engaged in this very important conversation, and I'm really grateful. So I do think we should give ourselves all a round of applause. So I'm going to invite our friend and comrade here, Professor John Volmink, to please assist us. So where do we go to from here with this work? After which we will invite the minister to offer us some closing remarks. So John, over to you.
Well, I promise to be very brief. I realize some people will have to take flights. So let me just say a couple of things before I talk about the way forward. For me, being here, I regard as a privilege, particularly since I was not ever part of such a large conversation where so many thought leaders have been brought into one room and apply their minds to where we're going to education. Also, I sat in the Rural Education Commission, and I was enormously impressed, and it was enormously instructive for me to be there, to listen to the quality of the discussion. I'd like to therefore congratulate the NECT and the leadership and its board and the CEO for this initiative. And I think Loiso Jita this morning, for me, hit the nail on the head. I don't know why it took us 20 years to do this. Maybe we should do it every few years. Allow me also to say that many of us can remember a time at the dawn of democracy when we started off bringing together 19 separate education departments, and where a plethora of green papers and white papers and other documents were being generated, and essentially because the conventional signposts have all been washed away. And in a sense, we were celebrating at that time the chaos of a new beginning. And now we're at a different point. The policy making, and this is not a policy making forum, this is a policy dialogue. The policy making going forward will be guided by the need, firstly, to address the asymmetry of our society and what it means to do education in a context where there's such a lack of congruence based on resources, location, language, etc. We should also take our bearings from the constitutional imperative that we should ensure parity for learners and for learning opportunities. For me, curriculum are those things for which a learner has an opportunity to learn. That's what a curriculum is. And then thirdly, we should not ignore, and this is how I want to just pause to say this. In moving forward in our policy making agenda, we should not ignore the gains that were made and the lessons that were learned over the past 2 decades. I think it's a false narrative, and it comes too easily off the lips of everyone, that we've not moved forward in education over the last 20 years. I think that's a false narrative. We've made so many gains in so many areas. But as we move forward, I think Crane Sodine timely reminder this morning that we have to accept that in that period, while we were taking up the challenge of translating strategic intent into operational reality, focus on that, that we may have been also developing blind spots. And I very much like that. And I think that was a sober reminder that this policy dialogue focuses our gaze, changes our gaze from just our achievements also to our blind spots. So I've listened to the discussion, and I think you would all agree there's a regularity in the responses that have come through, and a lot of them are interconnected. Let me just say what I think I heard. One is the need for tightening of governance with an interest in better quality of learning, the focus on quality and not just on access and massification. Secondly, the need to focus on teacher preparation and teacher professionalism, and without which there's no hope for a quality education for all. We talked about the inspiration for teachers and the identity of teachers. Identity and the role that they play in society should be celebrated. One key thing for me was the role of the communities and the role that those communities must play. And it is so important, whatever we do, that we ensure that communities become participants in the choices that affect their lives. And then underneath all of that, we have the possibility of using the innovation agenda to accelerate some of these things that we've pointed out about our school system, and that the system of innovation which is developing here in this country quite pleasingly would help us to get from where we are to where we want to be. So, where do we go from here? Allow me just in 2 minutes to say the steering committee is a 12-person committee. The steering committee had debated issues around what the themes are. So those 5 thematic areas came out of that debate. Those were taken to a stakeholder briefing for endorsement and for advocacy. And now we've seen today, I must say, since we only started in April, I was gobsmacked by the quality that came out of these commissions. They've done their research, they had their round table, and I just say, I want to applaud the conveners of the various commissions for in such a short period of time, they've come up with these reports that we had here today. So the steering committee will now be convening very shortly within the next week or so to look at all the reports after they've been reworked, because the commissions will now finalize their report. And based on the proceedings today, we will be trying to harmonize all the reports to ensure no inconsistencies or contradictions. We're not talking at cross purposes with each other. And then we'll try to develop a final report with a single powerful narrative which can be taken up by policy decision makers. And we want to acknowledge the commitment of the Minister to take these up in the policy conference. That's something certainly most welcome, and we want to thank Minister for that commitment. I want to say that it's obvious that we haven't resolved all the matters, if any, today. This process, which only started again in April, has been extremely a tight one, and with severe limitations on both research and consultation. And we know that and recognize, therefore, that there needs to be a lot more work to be done to bring this to conclusion, and so that we can delve deeper into the issues that we've identified. So, Minister, I want to just thank you for being here with us, the Deputy Minister, the Chair of the Portfolio Committee. Honourable Gina has left because she had to take a flight. And I really want to thank everyone that has come here today to share not only your thoughts, but your enthusiasm. We want to thank you. We have all your contact details, and we will provide you with a copy of the final report, which I hope will be the start of a new movement in education. Thank you very much.
So, Minister, you've got the opportunity. I just want to see how many of us need to get onto a flight before 7 p.m. Hands up. All right. So, Minister, you've got 5 minutes. Okay, 6 minutes.
No, thank you very much, Chair. I really have no intentions of taking your time, but to join Professor Volmik by thanking the NECT for bringing such great brains together. Thank you very much, Mr. Godwin. To thank the LRC also, which has supported us greatly. There's a song that says, if we really don't respect them, we won't get help again. I really want to thank the ERC for all the support they gave us, but also for the board of the NECT board, to thank you very much. Chair, I'm not going to engage with most of the matters which were raised. We've noted them. But also to say, I think Dr. Moluko will agree with me, it's been a very helpful, enriching exercise in view of the fact that we're going to the ruling party's policy conference, because I always raise this matter, Dr. Moluko, that especially in the last conference, there were resolutions which were taken. I said, my word, I hope I won't be here to have to account for this policy, because this thing is unimplementable. And one of the resolutions, Chair, had said we must wipe out all your multi-grade schools. And by the time I walked out, I knew it's not possible. But it's the policy decision that said we must implement 2 years of ECD. And I knew we have not even dealt with the first year, have not consolidated adequately. So I think this will really enrich and say where the issues are. I have a slight flu, Chair. What really, I think, excited me more than anything is what I think Professor Sujin said in the morning, that in terms of policy, I think there's some convergence. And we need to talk about the implementation of policy and some of the assumptions that we made around policy, but also engage around where we think there are gaps and getting a common understanding of what are the constraints that are there. I mean, for instance, the issue around, which I know Prof really likes talking about, lesson scripting, sequencing. I'm sure he's trying to deal with a problem, possibly by creating another problem. But the NECT will confirm, because it's not to punish teachers or undermine their professional abilities, but NECT will tell you that teachers don't complete the curriculum. How do you manage that? They'll tell us, monitoring will tell us that teachers jump topics which they don't like. How do you deal with sequencing and making sure that even if they combine lessons, the core of that level is being covered adequately? So those are the things you have to deal to say, this is an effort to try and deal with this problem. The same thing also with your progression, because sometimes in implementation, that's when you see the weaknesses in your policy, possibly. Because the policy on progression was agreed and passed in 2013. It was only when we were implementing that people started raising discomforts about the policy. So it's either you sit on it, then everybody's happy. You try to implement, then I think then you begin to see the problems around the policy. And the key thing may not be the policy itself, it's the assumptions that we made to say, because I think we're all agreed that by repeatedly failing learners does not necessarily close the deficits. The main gap, where is it? Perhaps it's around support that we give to learners who have not been able to, I think, finish the curriculum for that year. But I think for me, it raised quite a number of topics that I think we need to go back to. I mean, the language debate, I was saying to Professor Iron that I did some research more than 25 years back, and the questions remain the same about the language policy in education. I think once and for all, we have to confront this issue about language policy in South African education system, so that it's not abstract, it's not out there. It's say, what are the issues in the South African classroom? In the real world, which is in the education system, what is the, with limited choices, what are the things that we do in order, with the limited choices, what are the things that we do? But I think we have to confront it. So, Chair, in short, what I really think, and I think the gathering will agree with me, is to propose, Professor Volmek, that we continue with these dialogues. It's not very accurate that for 20 years we've not spoken, but perhaps we have not spoken in this forum. I know as any city there's been a number of dialogues on different topics. As DBE, we've called a number of roundtables, but I don't think we have been able to successfully convene the way any city has done currently. And I really agree with you that we need to have more frequent, so that's why I had to be very kind to the ELRC that they need to come more to the party. I think the next stage really is to really look at a forum where we discuss about what you raised, Professor, about policy implementation, where the blind spots are, where the gaps are, where the constraints are, and say exactly, let's be realistic, how do we implement that which we've agreed on? Because I think that's, for me, one of the grayest areas. And concretely want to propose, Professor, because it's your area also in the NCT, that, in Sutu they say you flog the hard-working horse. You don't flog any other horse because the lazy one will just sit down. So you flog the hard-working to pull everybody else. So you have horses already in the convener, and really ask these horses to plan towards the second dialogue where we really discuss much more deeper, now specifically around the things that we've identified here without flogging them back, and say, and really allow more time. I must thank really the committee that they got in. I thought we were asking for the impossible, so I know if you, I don't know if it's whether prayer or just assuming that things can happen. We were very hard and cruel to the team, Prof. I mean, didn't expect that we'll be able to have such quality discussion with a short space of time that was given to your team. And for that, I'm extremely grateful and appreciative. And I think both as a sector, as a department, we're going to take this resolution to the CEM, again engage with provinces, but also take it to the ruling party to make sure that indeed they're taking forward. There's a question you wanted, I can see watching your clock, Chair, that you wanted me to talk about your provincial. No, there was a question about the creating of bureaucracy versus partnerships. And I think I fully agree with that, but just if you're to allow me a second, I mean, I used to work as MEC for Social Development, where we relied solely on outside, on collaboration. And there was lots of strength in that because they brought innovation, they brought their resources, they were training all these other NGOs in social development. But when it came to a core mandate, like child foster care, you couldn't send them to court because they don't account to you. So it's getting the balance right also to say, on issues where it's your core mandate, you must have the bureaucracy to implement it whilst appreciating, so that you don't have the social development issue. I mean, if social development had enthusiastic NGOs like we have in education, they could have long liquidated them because they are reliant on people who can't implement the core mandate. And the last one was also relationship with provinces, and I'd say it's a PRO exercise. It has its own strengths, but it's a PRO exercise for different reasons. When people have been given power, for instance, to buy books, to ask them that you want to buy for them, it's like asking the buyer to say, bring them. So it's a big, big area, but it's an area that we're working on, and I really don't think we have time to get into that. But again, it's one area that we could keep on discussing as to how we further harmonize the working and the relationships between provincial and national. But Lilonke Puti, I really want to thank the NCT, the team that worked on the conference. Again, Muregi, ELRC, thank you very much, and the board, thank you very much for supporting us.
Hello, Prime Minister. I think the message is that Those before 7 p.m. need to leave now, and that means all of us can pack our bags. But let's give ourselves another round of applause. I know that there is much that can be said, but much will not be said by me. We all look forward to the report, isn't it? And to the impact of our work post the policy conference and post the elective conference of the governing party. You see, I use the word governing party, Minister. So again, thank you so much. All the thanks have been said, and I think we've done a great job today, all of us together. Thanks very much. Goodbye.